All right.
Okay, Greg, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us. Greg Russell has made quite a study of handling training, and I'm actually quite excited about the changes it's made in my handling training, and really want to spread that around. So, Greg.
So is this showing up on your screens?
Yep.
Yes.
It says click to add. Okay, that's my cue that I've forgotten to put it into slideshow mode. How's that? Good?
It works fine.
All right. Yeah, so quick background. This is basically how the way I have been teaching, and then others have been teaching with me. Basically, this started in 2003 when we didn't have a teacher at Melrose, and I started doing some teaching at Melrose shortly after returning to ringing there myself. But it is kind of compiled from lots of reading early on, viewing existing materials, lots of mistakes and growing pains, visiting bands, lots of video reviews, lots of pub discussions, and quite a few people. So quite a few people have contributed to this. I am the most OCD of the bunch, I guess. So consequently, I'm the one putting together this kind of presentation. So those contributors include, in particular, Tim Barnes was incredibly supportive at Trinity Wall Street when we were getting things going there, and helped in some of the innovations. And working with Michael Bush and Wieland at Smith College was instrumental. And Matt Austin at Kent, turns out, has been developing similar teaching strategies, although largely independently. So this talk is for handling instructors who would like to improve their own teaching. You guys can read the slide. I don't have to read it. But basically, this is the audience that I've kind of imagined this talk would be of interest to. And do feel free to interrupt me with questions. I think it'll be more interesting that way. So quick outline, just kind of some of the principles on which I'm trying to build the way we teach. Some things that I believe are myths that we need to work on busting. And then kind of the insights that we've gleaned over the years and some of the teaching elements that we're focusing on now. And then some time for discussion. So basically, this is where we start. Somebody have a question?
I just a small, right?
I can't hear.
The bags.
Andrea, I think you need to mute.
The bags down totally.
Tom, can you figure out who's speaking and mute them?
Tom, I think it's Andrea. Can you mute everyone?
So basically, we start by asking instructors to kind of make a commitment to emphasizing student safety, comfort, and outcomes over ego, which actually turns out to be hard. It's just hard for me. It's hard for everybody. Also to work collaboratively and to make a long-term commitment to continuous improvement instead of feeling like you've learned everything you need to know in 6 months and you're good for the rest of your life. So how does that continuous improvement manifest? First of all, observe. Other ringers, other teachers, your students. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see I say use video, collect video clips of your own teaching, of people that you've taught to ringing now, other people's teaching. Review the video. Look, I've watched hours of my own teaching and hours of other people's teaching, and it's probably the best learning resource there is for learning to become a better teacher. And then invite and accept constructive feedback. Choose people invite them to observe your teaching and provide offline feedback, not in the tower, not in front of your students, but kind of afterwards. You know, take some notes, jot them down, discuss it over a beer or a cup of coffee. And ideally work collaboratively with another teacher, either as peers or in a mentoring relationship. But if you haven't got a teacher handy, get one of your other ringers or a non-ringing spouse. It actually turns out an awful lot of the value, an awful lot of the feedback that I got came from driving home from Melrose for half an hour every week or twice a week with my wife, and she would tell me what she had observed as I was teaching.
Greg,
Counterproductive. Yes,
Greg,
Tom.
I have a question. Bill Cummings.
Oh,
You know that a slide or two ago, you had that part about the ego, and whose ego are you talking about? The teacher's ego or the student's
teacher's ego. Teacher's
Okay,
ego.
gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Counterproductive myths. Ringing is easy. I think one of the NAG brochures says it's like
No.
riding a bike. Teaching is straightforward. You know, hey, John, could you come do some backstrokes? We don't have enough teachers. Students will get bored if you don't move on quickly enough. So we rush to get them to set the bell. We rush to get them to ring both strokes. We rush to get them to ring in rounds. And they end up ringing in rounds, but their handling faults and difficulties then haunt them for years. Backstrokes are learned quickly, and then you can move on to more interesting things, and strokes and everything else, because you don't want people to get bored. Broken stays, just part of the process. Don't worry about it. It just happens. And you know, sometimes we celebrate them and write the learner's name on them. Blame the learner for breaking a stay, but they didn't have any idea what to do differently. Bringing up and down is an advanced skill. It shouldn't be. It often is, but it's better if we just incorporate it into the teaching process. It's important for the student to feel the balance early in the process. And I think this comes from the idea that it's like, if they can't, then I'm not sure where it comes from, but I found it actually causes an awful lot of harm. So we actually now avoid teaching near the balance until fairly late in the process. And students can just figure out how to put both strokes together. So you teach them one stroke, teach them the other stroke. You say, here, practice this a couple of times on a dead rope. So, all right, here we go. You take this hand stroke, I'll take the next stroke. You take this hand stroke. All right, you're good, go ahead. And it doesn't really work out that well. And it's important to discourage the dreaded floating right hand, which I agree it is, but not by just pointing out that it's a bad thing and then yelling at your student when they do it. We actually have to prevent it by good teaching strategies. So, little expansion. Ringing is easy, like riding a bike. Teaching is straightforward. We spend months learning basic bell handling. We spend years learning method ring. And ringing is a highly collaborative exercise, but teaching is not a highly collaborative exercise. For the most part, we teach all alone in the tower or all alone while the other ringers are sitting out in the antechamber. We provide only a few hours of guidance for someone learning to teach handling. You know, maybe they're mentored for, I don't know, half a dozen weeks while they're learning to teach, but somebody else is learning, is also teaching the next student over. Handling instructors, as I said, they work largely on their own, usually with little or no collaboration or support. And we just accept that a high attrition rate is normal and that many learners are hopeless. And you know, if 10% of them stick around, that's okay, that's great. That's all we can really expect. But I think all of these are counterproductive myths. We don't set our sights high enough, and we don't acknowledge just how important and difficult a skill teaching handling actually is. I put too many words in this slide, but basically, I just wanted to I kind of wanted to expand on the idea that people get bored. You can't take too long to teach somebody a ring. You've got to get them into rounds and call changes and method ringing pretty quickly, or else they're going to get bored and they're not going to come back. We haven't been finding this. That first of all, if you explain just exactly how complicated what they're trying to do is, and you break it down into simple steps, and you give them your clear objectives along the way, and switch it up a bit, keep it interesting. Everybody that I've worked with has quite a long attention span, except for the people that just don't find it interesting to begin with. Right? And they'll come once or twice and they'll say, yeah, this really isn't for me. Frustration and boredom stem from a feeling of stagnation, and as long as we can avoid that stagnation, things will be better. And stagnation often comes from not getting fundamentals down thoroughly enough and moving beyond them. So before somebody has really gotten the muscle memory and the instinctive feeling for how bell control works, if they're now trying to synchronize with a band and they're trying to learn rounds and call changes, it's just very, very difficult to make progress. Some key insights that I think are key insights. One is related to fear. I have done a lot of remedial instruction over the years. Not a lot of it has been with people who are fearful, but a significant number of the people that I've worked with have had a lot of handling problems and ringing problems that are actually associated with fear. And whether that's fear of the rope, fear of how the Sally behaves, fear that they're not going to catch the Sally, fear that they're going to break a stay, fear that they're not progressing fast enough, that they're somehow inadequate, just all kinds of different things that people are afraid of. And fear is just deadly to the learning process. It just is not a good motivator, and it doesn't help. And an awful lot of fear also results from rope dynamics and an inadequate understanding of how rope dynamics work. Basically, the backstroke determines an awful lot of what happens in bell control and rope control. So follow through, follow through, follow through. Follow through makes the Sally manageable, and making the Sally manageable prevents fearful situations from developing. Fear interferes with getting a good follow through. If you're now afraid of what's going to happen on hands, you're afraid of the Sally, you're afraid of the rope. The tendency then is to cheat on the follow through, and that makes everything worse, creating a vicious cycle. So we explicitly demonstrate and teach about rope dynamics, how the rope responds to mishandling, what exactly it is that clean backstrokes and clean follow throughs are meant to accomplish, how to recognize if you're not getting a good follow through, how to recognize if you're pushing the rope away from you, so that the student is actually armed with all of this knowledge so that they can kind of do some self-monitoring and help out the teacher a bit. And this works for 8 and 9-year-olds. It's not just for sophisticated 30-year-olds.
This is John. And just to confirm, when you're talking about follow through, you're referring to specifically whoever's on the end of the rope following through and pulling all the way through the stroke.
Backstroke follow through, that flip at the bottom, making sure you're getting a long enough, steady enough stroke that it determines the path of the rest of the rope coming down from the ceiling and the Sally.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then another insight that is often overlooked is that when ringing a medium-sized bell, this is not true of tiny bells, but when ringing a medium-sized bell, especially one that has a long draft, there is much more work that has to be done on the hand stroke than there is on the backstroke. But we often end up accidentally encouraging students to help the teacher to keep the bell, to regulate the bell height by pulling the backstrokes a little bit harder. And if the bell starts to drop, we encourage them to pull the backstroke harder instead of pulling the handstroke harder. This actually ends up causing a lot of difficulty later on when they're trying to learn to ring rounds and trying to learn to strike well, and trying to set the bell for that matter. And we there are lots of different ways that we kind of inadvertently encourage this bad habit to develop. And again, I've worked with a lot of people who've already learned to ring, but they're struggling with rounds and call changes at plain hunt because they're overplaying their bell. They're worried about catching the sally because if they don't, they're going to break a stay. They're bouncing off the stay a lot. So it's an important thing to be avoided in the teaching process. And then another is that we actually use terminology that is not helpful in helping people understand exactly what the hand stroke involves, because we use words like catch and grab, and we often actually model holding our hands when we are ringing the hand stroke. We hold our hands at belly height or chest height as the sally comes down, and if we're worried that the learner is not getting a good straight backstroke, we also are worried about where the sally is going to end up, so we might actually look up. And so we're kind of, looking up, ready to catch the sally as it comes down, and we're talking about catching the sally later on. The hand stroke is much more like stepping on and off from a moving trolley or a magic carpet at the airport, not like catching a baseball or a football or a basketball. Another insight, I had previously done a lot of teaching with bell up, and then I had also tried out for a while teaching on down bells. And I abandoned teaching on down bells. I can't remember why. And then I started trying it again a few years ago when I was working with students at Groton, and basically discovered that the students and the teacher got exhausted pretty quickly, and it was quite discouraging. And so we started now teaching basically alternating on up bells and down bells. We begin with people learning to chime, then people learning to ring the bell halfway up. And once they've learned to ring halfway up, back down again, maybe twice, maybe 3 times, then we move on to ringing on an up bell. But that ringing halfway up and down gives them the opportunity to get the basic feel of the straight up and down motion. The flick at the bottom isn't quite the same as it is on an up bell, but it's close enough to be helpful. And that all of that experience that they gain, the muscle memory that they gain from ringing halfway up and back down again, is something that they can then build on when we introduce backstroke. As we go further, as they get 2/3 of the way up, 3/4 of the way up, it begins to develop a familiarity of what the bell is like when it's 3/4 of the way up. It will later on reduce the likelihood of the student panicking when their bell drops. So this is worked out really well. It also means that we can have 2 or 3 or 4 learners starting on the same day, and each teacher can work with 2 or 3 students, first on chiming, then on ringing halfway up and back down again, without a lot of danger associated with it, without a lot of fear associated with it. It takes a little bit of care. You don't want people to get the bell up too far, and then have move their hands up too quickly and get it yanked out of their hands, things like that. But it is definitely possible to manage multiple people learning on a down bell. It's not possible for one teacher to manage multiple people learning on an up bell. This is the biggest one. Excellent backstrokes are critical, and we spend a lot of time on backstrokes. When I was learning to teach, when I was teaching with other people early on in my ringing career, backstrokes seemed to be what you hope you had a talented student and you got through backstrokes in about 5 minutes and you moved on to working on handstrokes. I just don't. We haven't found that that works well. Time invested in good backstrokes is extremely worthwhile, and we can maintain focus while working on backstrokes, first by alternating with ringing up and down, and also by introducing new elements, one little element at a time that we add on to the backstroke. So first we get good basic backstrokes, then let's see what I've got on my next, there we go. You get good basic backstrokes. Then you work on momentum exercises, which is the teacher pulls a little bit harder and the student feels what happens. You actually explain to the student that when they feel extra momentum in the bell, it doesn't mean that they should pull harder, which is the natural reaction. But instead, it means that the bell has already got plenty of energy and it doesn't need any more. And they just need to give a nice smooth backstroke. And the teacher doesn't pull so hard, the bell is going to not go up all the way. It's not going to have as much momentum. They're not going to feel much tension in the rope. And they tend to just, the natural reaction is to keep your hands up there and not pull. And we need to train them the opposite reaction, the opposite muscle memory, so that they will sense that rope slackness. They will then pull a little bit earlier and they'll pull a little bit harder to add some energy back into the rope. Then we add tucking and restoring the tail end just in the crook of the thumb, not bringing the hands up, just doing it down below, but dropping it out of the right hand and then getting it back into the right with the proper timing. Then shadowing, first with the right hand only, then with both hands. Shadowing means bringing your hands up in synchrony with the teacher's hands. So the teacher has to bring their hands up and down at the right time, the right speed. And gentle gripping with right hand and gentle gripping with both hands. And all along watching for regressions, because as you add each increment, there's more going on in their cognitive mind, and they may regress in the quality of their backstroke. Any questions? No loitering. So this basically means that as you're doing all of this, as I said a moment ago, you have to be demonstrating good timing as you as a teacher are ringing the hand strokes, the student is ringing the backstrokes. Your hands are not busy while they're ringing the backstrokes, so you can do whatever you want with them. But whatever you do basically serves as a model that your learner is going to pick up subliminal hints from. They're going to unconsciously learn that it's okay to do what you're doing. And then later on, when they need to ring both strokes, it doesn't work out well. So loitering is hanging out with your hands at chest height, as I talked about a little bit earlier, right? If your hands are up here, then when you do ring the hand strokes, it's not going to look anything like what you need your ringers to do when you want them to put both strokes together.
Okay, so tell me again, what are you doing? What is the learner doing? And where are your hands that's not good?
If your hands are anywhere other than down near your belt buckle, pointed at the floor on your midline, and then you're modeling something that you don't want your student to duplicate later.
Okay, I'm still not. Sorry.
You will need to have one hand up or to help them with backstrokes occasionally. At the outset, you may actually be putting fingers on their hands and helping them with learning their initial motion. It's good to actually explain to them that, you are not currently modeling what it's going to look like when they are ringing those strokes. But when you are ringing just the hand strokes and they have gotten far enough along that they don't need reinforcement or babysitting to make sure that they pull the backstrokes at the right time, then you want to keep your hands on your midline and down pointed toward the floor, because that's where their hands need to be before they ring the hand stroke.
But you're not doing an entire pretend backstroke, or are you doing an entire pretend backstroke while the person's doing a backstroke?
I do not do a pretend backstroke. I don't know if it's useful or not. It's certainly uncomfortable. It's gotten to be, I've done it this way long enough now that it's uncomfortable.
Okay.
John, what's your experience?
I think my experience is it depends on what stage the learner is at as well, where it can help, especially near the beginning, modeling that they know the timing of bringing their hands up, letting the rope bring their hands up rather than anticipating. But at some point, once they have that rhythm down, it's less.
Yeah, I tend to keep that with my hand on.
Yeah.
I tend to teach that with my hand on the ringer's hands rather than modeling it visually.
I will say I haven't mimicked the backstroke, but one skill that I've been working on is not leaving my hands up in anticipation for the hand stroke, because that's the exact behavior that we don't want to introduce. So
yeah. The other thing is we don't teach the hand stroke as a separate thing. I haven't been able to see that it adds any value, and it often introduces problems. So instead, we introduce elements of the tail end handling, as I said on the previous slide, while practicing backstrokes. And that evolves all the way up to shadowing the teacher's hand motions and eventually laying their hands on the Sally without gripping it, and then gradually gripping it and gradually pulling it. So only once the tail end handling and shadowing are really solid, then we start working on gripping and pulling. The arms and hands should already know that muscle memory for all of the vertical motion and all of the tail end handling before they have to start worrying about pulling on the hand stroke. And then they start out just pulling gently for a short stroke, and they gradually pull a little more firmly for a longer stroke. The instructor is pulling a little bit less as the learner is doing more of the work. And the teacher is watching like a hawk to make sure that there aren't any deteriorations in the tail end handling or in the backstroke, the straight and fluid and backstroke with good follow through. And then making sure the bell doesn't drop. I guess I realized some years ago that I do this entirely by ear now. I just listen. If the bell strikes 2 times too close together, then it's dropped. And I need to pay attention, make sure that that I pull hard enough when I'm pulling the hand stroke to keep it up higher, and that the learner is pulling the hand stroke hard enough on their own when they are pulling the hand stroke. So we were just working on this with a student today. It sometimes takes a lot of encouragement to get them to pull the hand stroke hard enough. And this is actually one of the other things that teaching on a down bell is useful for, because just chiming a bell gives them some idea how hard they might need to pull, or at least how to pull the hand stroke hard, even though they may not need to pull it that hard in the future.
Greg?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Alan.
Alan.
Hadn't read far enough on some of your other documents. I'm intrigued as to how you teach the hand stroke without teaching it separately. I read the words up here, but I can't make sense out of it. And I'm not asking for you to explain it now, but I'd love to see some pictures or movies that talk about that.
There's no substitute for video for this. I have a bunch of video. I just haven't edited it or gotten permission to put it up yet.
Okay, thank you. You got a question in the comments.
Oh, would somebody read it for me?
Yeah. It's from Andrea Falk. So the teacher is ringing the hand stroke mostly, and the learner is gradually pulling it more, ?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and I can't remember if I mentioned it already or if it's on a future slide, but the fact that most of the work needs to be done on the hand stroke is an important thing for both the teacher and the learner to understand. The teacher needs to make sure that they are doing enough work on the hand stroke to keep the bell up so that they are not asking the learner to pull the backstroke too hard. And then as the learner takes over more of the responsibility for the hand stroke, the teacher pulls less, but needs to adjust so that the combined pull is the right amount. And so they ask the learner to pull a little bit harder, and they pull a little bit less.
So I don't know how to do that, putting the hand up thing.
What's that?
I don't know how to put my hand up in Zoom. So this sounds like it's less scary for the teacher and less options for things going horribly wrong. It sounds like a really good idea.
So some of this has been motivated by just trying to make teaching work better.
Yeah, it sounds like it worked better in terms of the physicality of it. It also sounds safer. Have you found that?
Well, it's partly motivated by teaching students at Groton, high school students at Groton. And what happened there was 4 years ago, five years ago, 4 13-year-olds at Groton taught themselves to ring from YouTube. And then 6 months later, I got involved in working with them. And I basically was working from the thesis that in order to have a successful program at Groton without a local staff ringer, we would need to get the students to the point after 3 years or so where they could help to teach the next generation of students. And consequently, I wanted the teaching process to be easier to learn and safer to do. So that has also factored into some of the way that I've designed some of this. The intent is for it to be safer and less scary.
Yeah, that's
A lot of this
why
is
I
based
don't
on
do the teaching, yeah.
a lot of this is based on doing video analysis after the fact, basically postmortems, when something went wrong while I was videotaping it. And then I would go review the video and try to figure out what went wrong, why it went wrong, what we could do differently so that just didn't come up anymore.
Ask if it's useful for the students to see videos.
Oh, yes. So, yeah, as I said, collect videos. I often will send the videos to the students or show the videos to the students. I didn't mention anywhere in these slides, but it can be very helpful. I think it is even more helpful as I'm working with people who are learning to teach. That's where I find the video is critical. It was critical for my own learning to teach because I could watch myself teaching, and kind of one of the there's a process of trying to figure out how somebody does something. It turns out that people are not good authorities on how they do things. And so if you ask somebody how they do something and then you observe how they do something, it's usually not. They usually don't line up. And so being able to observe yourself doing anything is a great way to understand how you're really doing it as opposed to how you think you're doing it.
Yeah, Greg, this is Chris Haller. I'm actually
Chris.
who had my hand up. I find it very useful to teach both hand stroke and backstroke because they are so different. And I repeatedly tell my students that they have to pull the hand stroke more than the backstroke. And I emphasize the length of pull, which goes back to your follow through, and how you have enormous power if you have a long pull on the backstroke. And so you have to be really careful of the backstroke. So I do emphasize that because you have so much power.
Exactly.
You have so much control. If you do it right, you have much more control than you usually need. But on the hand stroke, you have to, it's shorter. And yes, the idea of catching on the, like a trolley is a good thing, but that it is so different from the backstroke that I introduce them separately so that we can talk about them separately. And on the hand stroke, you have only so much length. So you learn precision, you learn bell control to make the most of that. You use the rope control to gain bell control. And I emphasize that the rope control and safety come first, but very quickly we're combining that with bell control. And then my third grand stage is learning to play well with others.
Yeah. So this long period of doing backstrokes and introducing these new elements, it actually also provides a lot of opportunity to talk with the learner while they are practicing, which forces them to use their cognitive brain to do the processing of the conversation with you while their hind brain is learning to make all of this automatic. But you can use that conversation time to also talk about the fact that you are doing a lot more work on the hand stroke and their backstroke is very gentle. And my hand stroke, I only have 2/3 of the length to work with that they have on their backstroke. So I have to pull it pretty hard. And it has to lift the weight of the rope up into the belfry. So you can either do this while you're not, separate from the instruction itself, or you can do this with the instruction itself. But I agree with you. They are very asymmetric, and that asymmetry has to be explained carefully. And but I haven't found that it's any more difficult explaining that asymmetry, teaching it in this evolutionary way rather than teaching it as a separate stroke.
Mhm.
And then when they actually do start pulling it, probably the biggest mistake, I think, one of the biggest mistakes you can make is when they are ringing both strokes, letting them get into a situation where you tell them to pull the backstroke harder.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Right? Because then you're
Wrong thing to
Right.
say, basically. Unless you're trying to already get into the idea of much more bell control, getting them into the idea of what is a dodge, when would you want more bell control, and why are we spending so much time on bell control if they're only going to ring rounds? But I try to give them an idea.
But you can't even ring rounds well.
I want to give them an idea of what is coming, like next month or in 2 months, what the future holds, so that they have an idea of the path of progression that they're on.
Yep. The other reason that well, there are a number of reasons why I don't like teaching the hand stroke separately. The main one is that there are so often adverse incidents when teaching the hand stroke separately. The learner doesn't let go. The learner catches the sally, but the bell doesn't go up as high as they expect it to, and the rope starts coming down again. There's just lots of things that tend to go wrong when teaching the hand stroke. And so going back to that, make it easier to teach. Instead of trying to teach a teacher how to successfully teach the hand stroke, how about if we just leave that out? And by the way, this also goes back to that myth that it's important to teach at the balance. We spend most of the time teaching below the balance. After the student has got both strokes together, after they can ring a bell up, after they can ring a bell down, after they can regulate the height of the bell, then we just ask them to ring slower and slower and slower and slower, and make sure that they're getting both strokes slower, both the backstroke and the hand stroke, going up near the balance each time. And eventually they just find the balance, and they're not bashing the stay. They're not having every, fourth or fifth stroke drop the bell, because the getting synchronized, the synchronization between the ringer and the bell is the hard part, right? You give them lots of practice at that. And then working at the balance just becomes much easier. If you try to get them to work at the balance before they've got that understanding, that kind of subconscious understanding of how their motions need to be integrated with the bell's motions, that's the thing that makes it all work.
Yes, it's a lot of encouragement I give them. You're ringing fast now, and that's good that you're ringing fast. And I've recently learned that just encouraging them to ring slower is a good way to gradually work up to knowing where the balance is. Yeah.
So,
sorry, one question here about that idea of ringing slower. This is Melissa from Seattle.
I'm Melissa.
Hi. So is the idea that, like, if you ask them, you mean like ask them to ring slower as if, let's say, like there were more bells in the round? So like more time between the noise of the bell. So is that what you mean by slower?
No, I don't try to introduce them to more bells before they have more control of the bell they're on, because that's an unnecessary complication. I just say you're going to need to know how to ring slower in order to progress later on, part of the progression.
And,
Okay, yeah,
and
that makes
what
sense.
what I meant by ringing slower is just having the top of each stroke go closer and
Mhm.
closer to the balance, so that
I see.
so that it hesitates a little bit longer up over the head.
And so
and-
you tell them to ring slower, so like that way they're kind of thinking to themselves the audio of the sound, like there's more time between the two sounds, and then that kind of like gradually translates to ringing closer and closer to the balance.
Mhm.
So they're kind of like connecting their like audio learning with the
Right.
motion.
And I'm giving them lots of prompting, right? It's pull the hand stroke harder, pull the hand stroke harder, let the backstroke stretch up a little bit more in the backstroke, let out a little bit of the tail end, catch the stally a little bit later and a little bit lower, stretch up on the hand stroke, pull the
Yeah.
hand stroke harder, right? And those are all the things that slow the bell down. And then what slowing the bell down means is it's getting closer and closer to the balance, so that it is falling away from the balance less quickly.
Yes, and
Yeah, that makes sense.
usually they are not listening, but that's okay. I don't let that worry me, because if they're not listening, it means they're thinking hard, and they need to think this through for themselves. Where is this going? If I ring slower and slower, what is happening? What am I experiencing, and how can I make this work for me?
Great.
Greg, I have a question for you.
Yes.
It's Yolanda from
Hi, Yolanda.
Hi. Thanks for giving us such a different approach to what I know. I've only learned to ring over the last 2 years. So I actually started with a hand stroke, and I thought the backstroke was very scary. I can still remember that.
I remember when I thought starting with the hand stroke was a good idea. That was around 2003.
Well, maybe in Calgary we're a little bit behind. I don't know.
Well, no, because there are reasons why the backstroke is also scary.
Yeah.
And it's scary for teachers too.
I have a question about introducing listening skills. I do a lot of reading online, and I would love to become a teacher, a bell handling teacher, and a teacher in my tower. Because we only have one teacher, which is a bit well, it's not enough. Let's put it that way. Yeah. So one of the things I read is that it's actually good to introduce listening skills at the start when people are actually learning to ring, so that you have to say dong when you think your bell will strike. The question is, do you actually do that, and at what stage do you start to introduce that?
We haven't been doing that. I think it is a good thing to do. I think we are a little bit spoiled in Boston because we have a lot of ringing. And so as soon as somebody's handling is coming along pretty well, we start encouraging them to come to some of the regular practices. Well, we have a couple of advantages. 18 months ago, we started this Friday night learners practice. And so we pretty much just teach handling and bell control there. We've had 2 of the learners there that have advanced far enough and wanted to start working on some of the kaleidoscope work and plain hunting on 3 before moving on to the regular practice. But by and large, we encourage the students, once they're close to ringing on their own, start coming to the regular practice, and then talk with them about what to do while they're there. Stand behind somebody, listen, explain to them that, you can tell when anybody's bell is ringing. It's ringing when the ringer's hands are coming up past their face, and you can listen and verify that for yourself. So yes, I agree that those listening skills are very important. We just tend to launch into those listening skill exercises when we bring them to the regular practice. Does that sound right, John? Or Laura, anybody else from Boston?
I
want to jump in?
I think there's definitely more that we can do from the learning or the listening perspective. But I think the times that we're ringing, especially with learners, are either on muffled bells or during a practice when there are several bells going at the same time.
Yeah.
And so
that makes it quite hard.
I think that makes it challenging, but I also don't know that we put as much focus on doing exercises or making a point of having people ring separately to listen. So that's definitely something to think about how we can incorporate.
By the way, when we started the Friday night practice, we had 1 student, 3 teachers, and 2 novice teachers. We now, more often than not, have more students than teachers. We typically have 3 or 4 teachers will show up on a Friday night, and we very frequently have 4, 5, 6, 7 students that will show up on a Friday night. So I was initially worried that, you know, we were training up a bunch of teachers that weren't going to have anybody to teach, and it was basically, it was kind of an if you build it, they will come kind of thing, right? Once we had a Friday night practice, learners showed up.
Awesome. I have another question. So here on the slide, you're showing the dreaded floating right hand. Can we talk more about how to get rid of that? Or I guess like ideally, you don't get it from the start, and then you don't need to get rid of it. But if you do notice it happening, what feedback do you give to try to get something out of that habit?
Actually, Chris and Helen may remember this.
Yeah.
When I started ringing at Melrose, I had a terrible floating right hand. And there was a visitor who had come to Melrose periodically and yell at me about it. And that went on for about 6 months. And eventually I yelled back at them and I said, do not say that again unless you can tell me how to fix it. And it took me about another 6 months to figure out how to fix it myself. And then it was something that I actually worked on figuring out how to help other people fix. So if you want to talk to me offline after this, I can walk you through that in more detail. But there is an exercise that already existed, I guess, that is called the marching exercise, because you ring the backstroke with your left hand and you ring the hand stroke with your right hand. So you're doing this. And what we worked on in New York is a variation on that, where you ring the backstroke with both hands, but the hand stroke with only one hand. And having that tail end in the left hand just sitting there gives you the opportunity for the right hand to learn the muscle memory to get off the stallion back onto the tail end. And I actually made a video demo of that a couple of months ago that I can share with you if you'd like. Is this for you?
Yeah, that would be great. No, it's something I've noticed for some other people, and like I didn't have good advice, so I don't want to make them mad if I don't have a way to fix it.
Yeah. When I was learning to ring, the popular thing was to ask them to pull out a $5 bill and hold it between their hands, and if they dropped it, I would get it. Or I should say that whoever was teaching would get it, which was done somewhat in fun, but I gather in some places it was actually done for real, which, you know, either they are humiliated, one way or another, it's humiliating and not very effective, I don't think.
Fine, because as someone who doesn't have a floating right hand, I tried that. There's the same thing with putting a rubber band around both your wrists.
Yep.
And the contortions you can go through to keep the $5 bill in place really make all of the rest of your handling worse. I don't know who thought of it. It was a bizarre idea.
I've seen it suggested again recently. It won't go away. It's still being suggested to teachers for how to solve their students' floating right hand problems.
At some point, maybe because of that, I decided to just not point out to people they had I mean, I'm not allowed to teach, but
Laura, both.
Yes. So is it just because you're not pulling straight? Why do you, what's the example you give for people why they shouldn't have a floating right hand other than that you shouldn't?
I just talked with Kyle about this the other day. Because first of all, if you eventually want to ring bigger bells and need to dodge them, you need to have your hands on the tail end before the tail end goes up. But more in general, if you are putting your hand onto the tail end after it's already in motion, there's a tendency, especially if you're a novice ringer, you can kind of overcome this with lots and lots of practice. But if you're a novice ringer, it's another thing that's perturbing the amount of energy in the bell and interfering with you feeling what the bell is doing, and just generally messing things up. It also means that you are missing the opportunity to adjust the rope length at the place where you should be adjusting the rope length. If you haven't got both hands on the tail end at the end of the hand stroke, you can't make tail end adjustments. And there really isn't any place else where you ought to be making tail end adjustments normally. There are other places where you can sometimes, but not where you should most of the time.
You're saying, so basically, if you have a floating right hand, that means your hand's not on the tail end, and that's where you're missing out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And when it does join the tail end, it can interfere with the bell rising smoothly without dropping. When you put your hand onto the tail end, it's another thing that can disturb the rising backstroke and prevent the bell from going up as high as you would like it to. And also makes it harder for you to feel what the bell is doing. If you're in a shaky tower, the frame is moving, and the bell isn't going to go up quite as high. You can't tell that as early because you are instead dealing with the disturbance in the rope that's coming from putting your hand onto it. Alan, you've got tons of experience. Does any of this sound right or wrong with you? Either Alan.
How about Chris? Yeah, I have my hand up. I have noticed that if a person gets into the habit of a floating right hand, it can be extremely difficult to break. It can take years to break that habit, or it may never be broken. And so I try not to let that become a habit from the very start. And I have two things that I use to prevent this when I see it developing, and it doesn't always develop. I have had learners who just don't develop the floating right hand. But here's what I do. First of all, I tell them that the bells we have are not the only bells in the world, and they're going to want to ring heavier bells. You did mention that. If and when they travel to ring in other towers, which is one of the wonderful things one can do as a bell ringer, to visit other towers in other places in the world, and I've had a lot of experience with that. And that makes the whole thing a lot more romantic and interesting to beginners, is that they've got the world before them. So that's one of the things I do, is to motivate them and to tell them that just because they can get away with it now does not mean that when the bells are very heavy, they will still be able to do that. And I emphasize that by showing them the sort of motions that it takes and the sort of attitude it takes to ring a really, really heavy bell, bells that are tens of hundredweights. And since I've had the experience, they listen to me because they're interested in bell ringing in the world. The other thing I do is point out that when your hands are coming down, the very last thing you do when the Sally gets away from you is follow through. Part of the follow through is putting your right hand on the rope on the way down, so that when your hands are at the bottom of the hand stroke, they are already in perfect position for the whole backstroke to take place. And then I try to make them model that. It doesn't, they can't perhaps do it, but I'm aware that what I need to remind them to do is to model that when your hand comes off the Sally, it goes straight to the rope on the way down. It's part of the hand stroke. Does not wait for the backstroke. A proper hand stroke leaves your hand on the rope.
Somebody at Trinity had quite a brilliant insight, which is that there may be ringers who can hear when their bell is striking. And they may correlate it with the fact that they're putting their hands onto the sally at about the same time, particularly if they're not a particularly advanced ringer. And you put your hands on the sally about here. And if you watch people with a floating right hand, they put their right hand onto the tail end about here on the way up. And so there is a symmetry about it, right? They are basically ringing the backstroke with some of the same physical elements that they are ringing the handstroke. So I think that may be one of the things that makes breaking that floating right hand a little bit harder. I now when I encounter somebody who's been ringing for a few years and they have a floating right hand, I ask them if they would like help fixing it, because maybe they don't, and it can be. It becomes a source of humiliation and shame. I think it's so many people point it out, and they don't offer solutions to fix it. You know, they just kind of point out, you've got a floating right hand and you should get your hand back onto the tail end. It's so hard to break that habit. And it's probably like, you know, stopping smoking cigarettes or something, which I don't know anything about. But so I think there are some people who just want to be allowed to ring the light bells at the towers where they ring, and they're doing okay, and they've given up, and that's okay. But if they want help fixing a floating right hand, I usually can help them.
There's a hand up for Alan.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Something I've done and had some success with a guy who developed a floating right hand was to get him to ring the hand stroke with only his right hand. So he's ringing the backstroke with only his left hand to start with. The hand stroke only with his right hand, so he catches the sally at the proper place, rings it and throws it through that hole in the floor, and then immediately transfers his right hand onto the left, which is already in the right place because it's there.
Yeah, yeah. That
And
variation of the marching.
Yeah. So he can ring the next backstroke with both hands, but then leave his left hand in that down position and ring the hand stroke with only the right hand and finish that. And for some people, it just seems easier to finish the hand stroke when only ringing with the right hand. And after you've done that for, a dozen times, you say, well, okay, now just do it with both hands. And oh, wow, you can,
Yeah, let's socialize that. Let's get that around. Yeah, I've been using it for about 15 years with a lot.
Yeah, that seems to work fairly well. But let's not forget those ringers. And I was ringing with one last night. He learned to ring at 12 years old. He's now 78. His style is atrocious.
Can he
It's
strike his bell in the right place?
He can ring anything you like.
Leave him
Because
alone.
he knows what his body and the bell, how they interact. And we can all, work towards that, can't we, in our own way? And one of the things that the art scheme or your scheme does is to try and make the beginning few weeks easier, and not make them take 10 years like they used to in the old days when there was nothing else to do in the village except ring bells and
drink.
You ring the second for 5 years, and after that we might let you ring the third.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
By the way, I put this copy of this slide at the end of the talk, almost at the end of the talk, because I really think it's the most important one, right? That if you want to get better at teaching, find somebody else to collaborate with. It doesn't have to be another teacher. It just has to be somebody that's willing to watch you teach and give you feedback. And select video and watch it. Give yourself your own feedback. Talk to other teachers. Get tips from them. I hope that John would agree that that's kind of been the emphasis on our Friday night classes. Although we often have too many students, and so the teachers don't get to talk to each other enough. But
Yeah, not always these recent ones, but I'll second the value in having that video, especially over the last month. I had realized that I had been bringing my hands up early when doing hand strokes with learners that are working on backstrokes.
You've been loitering.
Then exactly, I've been like, I suspect I may appear as the example in showing, but even watching successive videos, I've seen that I'm pulling them up later, but still putting my hands up early and giving a bad example at when somebody shadowing should bring their hands up. And so being able to see that visually, even when I know in the back of my head I'm doing that, helps give me a sense of how to better work with people as they're shadowing.
Maybe I could put in a couple more words about why I don't like teaching hand strokes separately, is because even if you don't model that badly, if you allow the ringer to ring hand strokes without having to ring the backstroke too, they will tend to bring their hands up early, and they'll get into that habit of loitering. And it takes a lot of effort to get a learner to ring a hand stroke properly without them also ringing the backstroke. So we do it incrementally, just a little at a time, these tiny little increments with the backstroke, and it just goes very smoothly. But you know, I summarize it by saying there's just too many opportunities when teaching hand strokes individually for problems to creep in, or for bad things to happen.
And I'll second on that note, thinking back on my experiences where things went poorly. I think a lot of the examples where the bell went out of control had to do with someone working just on hand strokes and holding on to the rope too long, for instance, and
pulling the bell down, getting their shoulders jerked.
Exactly. Any number of those scenarios. And so having an approach that doesn't rely on that and counting on explaining enough beforehand to, have them do this, but not for too long, or don't grab on at this time. And it has definitely felt a lot safer in that way.
Anna G. Hello, Anna G.
Greg, is there
Long time.
anything you'd like to say before I stop the recording?
Nope, I think we're good.
Very good.